Bueno, pues sí, como decía Nicolás, el objetivo del webinar es presentaros los tres pilares de la solución Algosec. Son módulos complementarios, pero bueno, son independientes, o sea que se pueden usar a medida de las necesidades y puede luego incrementarse. Está basado en una única plataforma, pero luego es modular y se pueden añadir los productos, ¿no? Antes de entrar dentro del detalle de los productos, algunas palabras sobre Algosec. Algosec es uno de los principales líderes en el mercado de la gestión de políticas de seguridad, con unos 2.000 clientes a nivel mundial y con clientes en España muy diferentes como telco, bancos, aseguradoras, pero también clientes más pequeños como ayuntamientos o incluso comunidades autónomas. ¿Vale? Los tres módulos de la solución son los siguientes. El primero es la base, o sea, Algosec Firewall Analysis o AFA. ¿Vale? AFA permite gestionar las reglas de filtrado en los firewalls, hacer optimización de reglas, cuadros de mando de auditoría de seguridad. Típicamente lo que os van a pedir en modo auditoría puntual a vosotros, ¿vale? Y bueno, si tenéis este tipo de petición de parte de los clientes, pues os propongo, os pongáis en contacto conmigo, ahora os daré mi dirección de email y os podré facilitar la licencia para que empecéis con la solución bueno, y con condiciones muy ventajosas, ¿no? Eh, Condiciones de risa, como dicen en las publicidades. La idea es que, bueno, toméis interés sobre la solución bueno, y que después tengáis la capacidad de venderla también al cliente si quieres seguir con la solución. ¿Vale? Además de esta capacidad de optimización de reglas, pues también vamos a poder, si se le da acceso a los routers y a los balanceadores de carga, tener una visibilidad sobre la red de extremo a extremo, ¿vale? Y así poder dar visibilidad en la red para poder simular la conectividad entre cualquier conexión de tal IP a tal IP, por dónde paso, por dónde me bloquea la conexión, por qué se bloquea la conexión ahí, porque, bueno, a lo mejor hay un drop en tal caso, si hay un any, por ejemplo, y entonces permite muy rápidamente saber por qué me está bloqueando, si se conecta, si está conectada esa conexión ya a la red o no, o sea que es muy práctico ese módulo cuando se tiene esa capacidad de integrar toda la lógica de la red. ¿Vale? Este es el primer módulo y Max os hará una demo de unos 15 minutos sobre esta parte, porque hay muchísimas funcionalidades e incluso si queremos ser sintéticos, pues hay que pasar un ratito. Luego, el segundo módulo es Fireflow o AFF. Bueno, Fireflow. Fireflow propone un workflow que simplifica el proceso de cambios para reducir los errores humanos, minimizar el tiempo para proporcionar el servicio claro, y al final pues, poder reducir el coste de este tipo de operaciones, ¿no? Porque puede ser bastante complejo, ¿vale? Luego, pues tenemos para terminar el módulo de Advis. Advis permite descubrir los flujos de las aplicaciones y las propias aplicaciones de negocio correlar esos flujos con todos los elementos subyacentes, o sea, los servidores, por qué servidores pasa, qué flujo hacen comunicar los diferentes servidores y luego pues permite correlar esos flujos con también por dónde pasa por la red, por qué nudos de red, por qué firewall pasa cada uno de los flujos y en los firewall qué reglas son activadas, ¿no? Y entonces se puede hacer una relación muy fuerte entre cada una de las reglas y las aplicaciones que están sirviendo, ¿vale? Y bueno, y luego pues se puede hacer un montón de simulación, saber si paro este firewall, qué aplicación me puede afectar, si tengo un ciberataque sobre tal firewall, pues cuáles son las aplicaciones en el backend que pueden ser afectadas. O sea, permite mucho más control y capacidad de decisión rápida cuando hay algún ataque, pero también permite tener un control muy fuerte de las aplicaciones y de su conectividad, que es una etapa muy importante para poder luego preparar un traslado, una migración de esa aplicación hacia la nube, por ejemplo, o que está muy de moda ahora, migrar esa conectividad, o sea, regla de filtrado, a una nueva regla de tipo microsegmentación que vamos a poder hacer con un Cisco ACI o con un NSXT de VMware o otra arquitectura. Y bueno, y eso pues si no se tiene el control de la conectividad de las aplicaciones es muy difícil poder llegar a ese tipo de migración. Y ahí es bueno, la ventaja de tener AppVis es único en el mercado, o sea que somos lo único a proponer este tipo de servicio que va de manera automática identificar todos los flujos y hacer el mapeo de la aplicación con relación a toda la parte de la infraestructura que soporta esa aplicación. ¿Vale? Bueno, esto es un resumen de alto nivel. Ahora vamos a ver de manera muy práctica con Max esos tres módulos. Al cabo de cada módulo haré una síntesis de todo lo que se ha visto, por lo que no están muy a gusto con el inglés. Bueno, Max es ruso, o sea que cuando habla inglés se entiende bastante bien. Pero por si acaso yo cada 10 minutos pues haré un resumen por si acaso, ¿vale? Ok, pues también quería deciros algo. Volver a insistir que si tenéis preguntas podéis ya sea mandar por el chat o también podéis mandarme un email a la dirección esta antonio.padilla@algosec.com y en principio pues contesto bastante rápidamente, ¿vale? Ok, pues para mí hemos terminado esta introducción. Ahora vamos a pasar a la parte más práctica con la demo de Max. Max, it's over to you now for the first demo.
Thank you very much, Antonio. So thank you everyone for joining, and I apologize for having to do this in English. My Spanish is quite poor. So let me try and share my screen. Please let me know if you can see my screen.
Yes, we can see it now.
Okay, perfect. We will try to make this reasonably interactive. So if you would have any questions during the demonstration, please do not wait, just interrupt me and I'll try to answer your question right away. So the Algosec solution can be installed on-prem on a virtual machine or on a physical appliance. It can also be deployed in the cloud. It's totally up to you. And when you've installed the system, you start adding your layer-free networking devices, whether these are firewalls, routers, load balancers, and so on. We also support software-defined networking solutions like Cisco ACI and VMware NSX. And of course, we also support the public cloud. So as you can see here on the left-hand side, I have quite a few devices. I have some Cisco ACI, I have checkpoints, I have public cloud instances like Azure and AWS. So all of this are fully supported. Now, when we're connecting to your devices or to their management platforms, we fetch two kinds of information. The first kind of information is the security policy, the security rules. The second kind of information is the routing table. Based on the routing table, we can draw a that looks like that. So generated automatically. You don't need to do anything manually. And what you can see here is the core backbone network, the network which connects all the networking devices. So you can see here the on-prem environment that I have some Ciscos and checkpoints and Juniper, and the cloud environment as well. So if you have a hybrid environment where we have both public cloud and on-prem installation, Algosec can help you with that. I'll show you a few more examples. Now, we are not presenting you with all interfaces which are directly attached to each device, because if we'll do so, the map will be very cluttered. It will be very difficult to find something. However, if you're interested, let's say we'll take this SRX device, we can double click on it. That would expand and show you all the remaining interfaces, VPN tunnels, etc. Why would you care about the network map? The first thing you can do, you can use it for troubleshooting. You can do this yourself as a network or firewall administrator. You can also expose this to other departments, for instance, the help desk department. If they receive a call and they suspect that there is a network issue, they don't need to contact the administrator. They can just check this themselves. So let's try to ask a question. And I'll try to show you an example with both an on-prem environment and the public cloud. So we're asking whether this IP address is allowed to communicate with that IP address using FTP. We are running the query, and the system checks internally, without launching any real traffic, whether the source is allowed to communicate with the destination. So it checks whether traffic is routed from source to destination, and it checks the security policy of the relevant devices and path to determine whether their policy allows or drops this traffic. So in this example, you can see that the traffic is actually being blocked. You can see the list of devices which are blocking this, and you can see a network map. So let's zoom in a bit and take a look at the network map. We can see that the traffic originates in this cloud, which is connected to this network device. And then we can see it's being blocked by Checkpoint, by Juniper, and then it goes to the AWS cloud via VPN connection, and it's being blocked by a security group which is applied to an EC2 instance. You can see the traffic flow within the public cloud as well. So you can see we have the VPN connection, and we can see the VPC router. We can drill down even further if we are interested and actually see what rules on each device are blocking this traffic. We can see, for instance, that on the Checkpoint device, we have an explicit rule, rule number 52. That's a cleanup rule which blocks this traffic. So this is the first thing we can do with the network map. We'll return to it a few times during the presentation, but I just want to emphasize how we understand the network traffic, because most other products are based on this understanding. Any questions so far? Antonio, do we have any questions, or should we move on?
Apparently not. I will just summarize what you have seen. Bueno, lo que se ha visto es como el mapa de la red que se agrega según el nivel de enfoque que se desea para tener, sea más lisible. Y bueno, y también esa capacidad de poder hacer esas peticiones para saber exactamente de tal IP por dónde comunica y contar servicios, si se corta, si pasa por la red o si está cortado y por qué está cortado. Y bueno, eso, la capacidad de simulación que comentaba antes. Okay, Max, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Antonio. So on top of troubleshooting, we can also provide you with reporting. We can generate a report for a single device, for a small group of devices, or for the entire network. So here you can see a report for the entire network. You can see the list of devices which are part of this report. We can support multiple devices of the same vendor, or we can support multiple devices from different vendors. As you can see here, we have NSX, ACI, we have Palo Alto, Checkpoint, Azure, and many other vendors. So the report can be roughly divided into two parts. We have the information security part, and we have the policy optimization part. So let's start from the information security part. For instance, we can show you whether your environment is compliant with this or another regulatory standard. Let's say if you are a financial organization, you might be interested in the PCI DSS standard. And you can see here that my environment is about 60% compliant with the PCI DSS standard. So if I drill down, I can see once again the list of devices which are part of this report. And if I scroll down further, on the left-hand side, I can see the actual requirement. That's a plain copy-paste from the standard. And on the right-hand side, we can see whether we fulfill this requirement or not. And if we do not fulfill the requirement, it will tell me exactly where the problem is coming from. So let me show you an example. If we scroll down to the very bottom, we can see here that we have a risk assessment. So for instance, we have a risk saying unauthorized traffic from other to PCI zone. That's a clear violation of the PCI DSS standard. So I can click here. see which firewall devices, which SDN devices are responsible for that. And if I click on details next to one of these devices, the system would provide me with a description specific for this device. If I click on details once again, it will show me the specific rules on this device which trigger this risk. So I don't need to make any educated guesses. The system will tell me exactly where the problem is coming from. Now, that's when it comes to traffic risks. But PCI DSS is not limited to traffic risks. PCI DSS also takes into consideration endpoint vulnerabilities. So if I scroll a bit up, one of the PCI requirements, this requirement, 6.1, is to establish a process to identify vulnerable assets. And here we can actually integrate with vulnerability scanners like Qualys, Nessus, Rapid7, and others, and fetch information about your endpoints, understand which endpoints are part of sensitive applications which intersect with the PCI zone, and then we can show you whether there is a problem. Here we can see that there is a big problem. We have the help desk marketing business application, and it's part of the PCI zone, and we can see its vulnerability score is very low. So we can drill down and try to understand where the problem is coming from. So right now we're going to take a look at the application documentation. We'll discuss this in detail a bit later, but I just want to give you a glimpse into the security part and how it's relevant for the PCI DSS standard. So I can see my security rating is very low, and I can see the endpoints which are part of this application. So I can drill down and see that this endpoint is the most vulnerable one. And shortly, you'll be able to see the vulnerabilities as they were identified by the vulnerability scanner, in this example, Qualys. So here, for instance, I can see that I have a default SSH password for root. That's obviously a critical vulnerability. On top of that, I can take a look at the application diagram and understand business-wise how this application is working. So just give it a moment to load. You can see here the different security zones. You can see that I have some hosts in the PCI zone that have some vulnerabilities. The color coding stands for the vulnerabilities interact with other zones like the external zone or the private zone and so on. So the idea here is that you can present a compliance report to your auditor, to your manager, to anyone who might be interested. And if you need to troubleshoot and understand where the problem is coming from, it's very easy to drill down and see the specific hosts, specific vulnerabilities, as well as relevant firewall rules. Another thing that we have when it comes to security assessment is that we can enforce your corporate security policy. So you can see here a risk assessment which is not directly related to PCI DSS. You can see a risk assessment which can represent a violation of your corporate policy. So you can have multiple policies. You can have your own policy. You can have the PCI DSS policy. You can mix and match any way you want. And another thing I would like to show you, let me show you this on an example of a specific device. Let's try to find, let's say, a checkpoint device. You can review each device individually. So if you would like to see which risky rules exist on a given device, you can click here on risky rules, and it will load a list of risks which are relevant for this specific firewall. So here you can see that we have some rules. For instance, rule number 3, it's a global rule, and that triggers 1 critical risk, 4 suspected high risks, and 3 medium risks. On top of that, we can show you whether a given rule allows access to a vulnerable server. So here, for instance, we can see that we have a server behind this rule, which has a security rating of 83. This one has 50. Let's take a look at the 50. It's more interesting. So we can see that this rule allows access to this host, and this host was scanned by Qualys, and these vulnerabilities were identified by Qualys. So the idea here is to provide you with real attack vectors. So if you have a vulnerability, but nobody can access the server, okay, you can patch it a bit later. However, if you have a vulnerability and this vulnerability can be exploited by an attacker located in an external network, which can access this vulnerable endpoint using a firewall rule, this is something that is significantly more dangerous and should be prioritized. So that's the idea behind this functionality. Any questions so far? Or maybe, Antonio, you want to summarize this?
Yeah, well, we had a question I didn't see earlier. So the question is needing AFA in order to work or being deployed?
So the answer is yes. The AFA, the firewall analyzer, is the basic product. It takes a snapshot of your network. It understands how traffic is routed from point A to point B. So AFA is the most fundamental component. All other components are built on top of AFA. So you can have AFA without anything else. However, you cannot have anything else without AFA.
Bueno, para resumir, Advis lo que va a hacer es identificar todos los flujos de manera automática en la red y luego mapear lo que ha encontrado y correlarlo con la parte que está en AFA, porque AFA ya ha descubierto toda la red, el funcionamiento de los routers y entonces vamos a poder plasmar esa visibilidad de la aplicación con la visibilidad dentro de la red y de la seguridad y así poder llegar a este tipo de retrodocumentación de la conectividad de las aplicaciones o podemos llamarlo un tipo de CMDB de la conectividad de las aplicaciones, ¿no? Y sí, AFA es la base, el núcleo de la solución y por encima vamos a poder poner la parte Advis y la parte de automatización de los cambios con Fireflow. Y bueno, lo que hemos visto hasta ahora pues es la parte de reporting para ver si hay un gap con el respeto de los estándares tipo PCI, SOX o OSI. Bueno, hay un montón de diferentes estándares que están incorporados en la solución y también poder plasmar las reglas de comunicación de la red, ¿no? Tal tipo de VLAN solo puede comunicar con tal otro tipo y poder gestionar eso como una regla y para ver cuáles son las desviaciones. Okay, Max, you can pursue.
Thank you, Antonio. So, and the last thing I would like to show from the security perspective of the report is the baseline compliance. So the idea behind baseline compliance is that we're not checking the information security policy of the device, we're checking the operating system setting of the device. So for instance, if you have a large estate of Cisco routers, you might want to make sure that the login banner contains something about your local regulation. Or for instance, you would like to make sure that some service is running or turned off. In this example, for instance, we would like to verify that DHCP is disabled. So Algosec can connect to the relevant devices, check their configuration and report back if there is any violation. So if you have a large estate of devices managed by different administrators, in the click of a button, you can get a report and see if there is any operating system which is misconfigured. Now, let's talk a bit about policy optimization. The idea behind policy optimization is that we can inspect your rule base, your objects, and inspect the traffic logs the device generates and provide you with recommendations regarding the best way to optimize this rule base. So for instance, here you can see that I have some rules which were unused for the last 110 days. If a rule is being unused for a certain amount of time, I can select the relevant rule and disable this. Of course, I can do this manually myself, or I can automate this using Algosec. So if you have like 500 rules you need to disable, obviously you don't want to do this manually. We also have covered rules. The idea behind covered rules is that traffic would never hit this rule because it's being covered by two rules located above it. So this is something very nice because you can clean your rule base without actually affecting the traffic. And the fewer rules you have, the easier it is to manage the environment. We also have the redundant special case. Here it's pretty similar to covered, but slightly more interesting. The idea here is that this rule, for instance, would receive traffic. However, even if you're going to remove this rule, another rule, which is located below it, would still process this traffic. So traffic would be allowed, even if you're going to remove this rule. We also have the intelligent policy tuner. Most items here are pretty much self-explanatory. I'll not spend any time on them, but I would like to show you the policy tuner because that's a really nice functionality. The idea here is that on top of analyzing the device configuration, we can also analyze the traffic logs. So we can show you, for instance, how you can optimize a given rule base. For instance, we have the any in the service, so we can click on the any and see exactly what's being used. So the traffic logs show me that only a subset of services is being used. All the rest are not being used. So the system provides me with a recommendation to replace the relevant any entry with a specific service object that would contain only those which are being used. So the same kind of recommendations is also available for source and destination. So for instance, here you can see that I have a group which is being used in the source. However, when I inspect the logs, I can see that only a single IP address is being used. So the system provides me with a recommendation to replace the wider group with a specific source object. So that's for the optimization part. And the last two things I would like to show you before we move on to the second product. The first thing I would like to show you is the change monitoring. So the system constantly monitors your devices for changes. And if somebody makes a change, the system would automatically identify that and report using a syslog message, using an email alert, and of course using the web interface. So for instance, here I can see that somebody made a change on this Meraki device. I can drill down and see exactly what was the change. So I can see that some things were added, some things were removed. I can also see the impact of this change on my compliance with PCI or some industry standards. Here I can see that a lot of access has been removed, so the security rating increased. And the last thing I would like to show in the context of Firewall Analyzer is the reporting capability. So we have multiple dashboards available out of the box, and we use industry standard tools like Kibana to generate those. So here you can see some dashboards which are built in. However, if for some reason you do not find our dashboard sufficient, you would like to create your own, you have specific reporting needs, what you can do here is go to Discover and see all the raw data which is available in the system. And then you can take this raw data and build your own dashboards, visualize whatever you need to visualize. So that's Firewall Analyzer in a nutshell. And if you have any questions, please go ahead. If not, Antonio, I guess you can summarize and then we can move on to Fireflow.
Sure. Así que bueno, lo que acabamos de ver es primero el baseline configuration que permite monitorizar el respeto de la configuración. Si está siempre alineada la configuración de cada elemento de la red, ya sea firewall o router o lo que sea, o administrador de carga, ¿por qué no? Con la política que ha estado definida, ¿no? Y también hemos visto las funciones que permiten optimizar las reglas, como cancelar reglas que no sirven, que hemos visto que en los pasados 3, 6 meses, un año nunca han sido activadas. O sea, esas se puede cancelar y quitar de ahí tranquilamente. También reglas inútiles porque están cubiertas por otras reglas anteriores o cubiertas posteriormente por reglas más genéricas, lo que hemos visto con los dos paraguas. También hemos visto cómo cerrar reglas demasiado abiertas. Y hay any, pero al final hemos visto que en los 6 pasados meses solo pasan 3 objetos. Pues podemos limitar tranquilamente esos 3 objetos, que no pasará nada, ¿no? Bueno, digo 6 meses, podría ser más. Solo luego se puede definir el periodo que se quiera considerar. Y bueno, también hemos visto cómo se pueden identificar los cambios en modo pirata, o sea, fuera del proceso de Algosec, y ver si cumplen o no con las reglas de seguridad. Y para terminar, lo que hemos visto son los reportes estándares que proporciona la solución y la capacidad también de adaptarlo fuera de la solución con Kibana. Okay, I think that's it.
Okay, thank you, Antonio.
There is a question.
Sí. Could you please summarize what capabilities are available in ACI integration? Good
Absolutely.
question.
So when it comes to ACI, Algosec connects to the APIC and the MSO controller. If you're using MSO, you can see an example here on the left-hand side. So we can see the MSO and we can see the tenants which are configured via MSO. We can also see some tenants which are configured directly. So here you can see that we have a dedicated report for each tenant. So if I open a report for a tenant, I can see pretty much everything that I can see for a standard firewall, like risk assessment, regulatory compliance, and so on. So if you need to demonstrate that your ACI fabric complies with this or another standard, that's pretty easy to do. On top of that, we have excellent understanding of the traffic flow. So let me show you an example. If we go back to the traffic simulation query, what we saw at the very beginning, we can ask the system a question: is traffic allowed to flow from point A to point B? And that, of course, takes the ACI fabric into consideration as well. So let me see if I have a good example. So we are going to ask whether some IP can talk to another IP, like this one to that one, over TCP 900. And we are going to determine where the source is located, whether it's somewhere in the network or maybe it's an EPG, and see how traffic is flowing. So we understand traffic flows through the ACI fabric, outside the ACI fabric, like L3 out. And of course, if you're using service graphs, then service graphs are also understood. So if traffic, for instance, from ACI is being redirected to an external firewall, we can see that. In this example, you can see that the traffic is being blocked. You can see here that traffic originates in this network. We can see the relevant ACI VRF. So we have the ACI 3_prod1, that's the tenant, and the CPG is the VRF. And we can see that the destination is a virtual machine in our NSX environment. So Algosec understands all of that. On top of that, Algosec can also perform automation. We'll see this shortly. That's the next product. Any additional questions before we move to Fireflow?
No other question.
Okay. So now we're gonna switch to Fireflow. Fireflow is our change management solution. The firewall analyzer, the solution you've seen so far, this solution basically takes a snapshot of your network and tells you what can be improved, what can be done better. Now, if you want to automate things, that's where Fireflow comes into play. So you can create a request in Fireflow manually. That's what we're going to do right now. But of course, you can also do this via an API. So you can just create a request via ServiceNow, Remedy, Service Desk, or anything else, and Algosec would intercept this under the hood and do everything for you. So what we're going to do right now is ask to allow access from this source to that destination using any service. We're submitting the request, and the first thing the system does, it checks if it's already allowed, because if it's already routed and allowed, there is no need to disturb the information security officer or the network administrator. The system would automatically close the change request and let the user know that no action is required because everything is allowed. If, however, traffic is blocked, the system would identify the relevant devices in path. So the network administrator doesn't have to open the big visual map. The network administrator doesn't have to run any trace routes. The system will tell us automatically which devices are blocking the access. So here we have an interesting example. We have some traditional devices like AFM F5. We have the NSX. We have also Fortinet. But the interesting part for the ACI is that we have the ACI tenant, which is in path. But on top of that, we also have a firepower, and the firepower is basically a member of a service graph. So you can see that if there is a service graph, we can identify this and provision the change there as well. The next stage is the information security assessment. So during the information security assessment, the system would perform a what-if analysis, telling us if implementing this request would violate our corporate security policy and or some standards like PCI DSS. So you can automate this phase as well. You can say if there is no violation, if everything is compliant, let's just approve this automatically. However, if there is a violation, let's stop, let's review this manually and decide whether it makes sense to approve this despite the risk, or maybe we should just reject it. So let's just reload this to get the latest and greatest information. Now, in real life, you also don't have to sit and wait like we're doing right now because everything is happening under the hood. The reason why I'm doing everything manually today is because I would like to show you each and every step. So here you can see the risk calculation in process, and on top of that, you can also see the vulnerabilities tab. The idea here is once again that we integrate with vulnerability scanners, and we can present you whether this request is asking to allow access to a vulnerable endpoint. So I can click here on vulnerabilities and the system would show me if there are any endpoints which have vulnerabilities. I can see that the request is asking to expose access to this server and to this network. However, there is no scanning result from Qualys for this IP ranges, so it says NA. But if I have, for instance, a high risk, then potentially I can tell the user, please go ahead and patch your server before I approve this. Okay, moving forward, here you can see that two security policies were evaluated, the standard one and the perimeter one, and I can see that I've asked to allow any service. Allowing any is obviously a risk, so that was triggered. Now let's say I'm okay with this risk. I can just approve this and move to the interesting stage, the implementation stage. So the user would receive an email message saying that his request has been approved, and we move to the implementation stage where we will actually see what's the best way to implement this change, whether it would be to add a new security rule or maybe modify an existing one. And you can see here that we have a dedicated sub-ticket for each device. So for instance, if you have one team managing the F5 and a different team managing the ACI, that's not a problem. You can dispatch the sub-ticket to individual teams. Now let's take a look at the recommendation for ACI. By the way, while it's calculating, one thing I would like to mention is that auto provisioning and automation for ACI, that's a unique competitive advantage of Algosec. None of our competitors has the ability to provision changes to ACI. Any questions while the system is loading?
No question. Maybe I could take advantage to summarize.
Sure.
Así que, bueno, lo que hemos visto es que Fireflow propone un workflow muy adaptable, se puede adaptar a la organización y también decir, pues hay un grupo específico cuando se trata de hacer el cambio sobre ACI, por ejemplo, para tal, yo que sé, Palo Alto o Checkpoint, en tal región, pues hay un grupo determinado que únicamente él puede tratar ese tipo de cambio. Y bueno, muy adaptable en todas las etapas del workflow. Eh, También propone un análisis automático del riesgo. Si hay riesgo, pues vamos a querer, por ejemplo, pedirle al experto de seguridad si acepta o rechaza el cambio, teniendo en cuenta ese riesgo. Se le da todos los detalles de por qué hay un riesgo, porque violamos tal o tal regla, ¿vale? También tiene capacidad de pedir más información, o sea, no lo acepto, pero dime, o puede hacer sugestiones, o sea que también vamos a rastrear todo el historial de esa petición, aunque haya ida y vuelta. Y eso también es bastante único en nuestra solución. Como lo es también poder hacer cambios en ACI, que como lo decía Max, es una ventaja competitiva que tenemos en el mercado. Y claro, si no hay riesgo, podemos pasar esa etapa, si se quiere, eso se puede adaptar también, para no molestar la seguridad en ese caso y claro, poder optimizar el tiempo para proporcionar el servicio cuando no hay riesgo, no hay por qué pedirle el visto bueno a la gente de seguridad. Pero bueno, como todo eso se puede adaptar a lo que se decide para tal o tal implementación. Max, okay, you can.
Okay, thank you, Antonio.
Yes.
So here you can see a recommendation for Cisco ACI, and the recommendation is to create new objects, new EPGs, and to add a new contract. And you can see here that we have the consumer EPG, the provider EPG. So there is end-to-end automation. Now, one thing I would like to emphasize is that although the system offers you end-to-end automation, you still have manual control if you want. So if you click here on edit, you can see, for instance, that the system recommends me to create a new EPG here in the provider EPG, but I can decide that I would like to use a different object. For instance, I would like to use a wider object and use this EPG instead. So I can just save the recommendation, and now it will use an existing EPG instead of creating a new one. So you have full control. Now, if you would like to add a new service graph, you can do it from here as well. So you can control everything end to end. And at this point of time, we have two options. The first option is to go and implement the change manually. The second option is to let Algosec connect to the APIC and provision the change. Now, I spoke about ACI, but of course, the same capability is available for other platforms. So if you would like to provision changes to your Fortinet, or for instance, your public cloud like AWS or Azure, Algosec supports that as well. Now, the remaining two phases are completely automatic. We have the validation phase. The idea behind the validation phase is that the system checks whether the opening has been correctly implemented. So for instance, if I request an access from my computer to the internet, you approve this access, but the network administrator decided to be very generous and give access from the entire subnet where my computer is, the system will tell you validation has failed. Yes, traffic is allowed, but the opening is wider than initially approved. So you have at least 2 points of control for each change. You have the first point of control, performing risk assessment before you actually implement the change, and you have the second point of control, which performs validation to make sure that the implementation is accurate. And last but not least, we have the auto-matching phase. The idea behind auto-matching is that the system constantly monitors your devices for changes. And if there is a change detected, the system tries to correlate this change with an explicitly approved change request. However, if the system finds a change without a request, you will receive an alert. Here you can see that I have multiple changes without a request. Now, this is a lab environment, so it doesn't really matter. Nevertheless, in production environment, you might want to consider each entry here as a security incident, because nobody should make any changes to your environment without your explicit approval. So that's pretty much it for Fireflow. There are multiple features here, so obviously we cannot cover all of them. The two last features I would like to show you today when it comes to Fireflow. First one is the configuration of the business process itself. So the business process we went through, that first we have the networking team, then we have the security approval. That's a decent business process. It works in many organizations. Nevertheless, your process might be different, or you might have multiple business processes. So you might have one business process for non-technical people that requires technical approval, and another business process for technical people where we can skip the approval. So for instance, here you can see the business process we just went through, and your request is being submitted. The system checks if it's already allowed. If it's already allowed, it closes it. If it's not allowed, it goes to the networking team, then the security team. And let's say we would like to skip the security team. Once again, that's a workflow for a technical individual. So you can see here that we have this arrow taking us from the planning phase to the approval phase. So we can just go ahead and change the target status to create work order. So if we click here on Save Draft, you can see that the change is immediately depicted. So we move straight from planning to implementation, completely skipping the approval. Now, the reason why I'm showing you this is just to show you that Algosec can be easily customized. So if you have a new business process or you need to modify your existing business process, you don't need to pay fortune for Algosec professional services. You don't need to start writing different scripts and code. You can just do most of these customizations using our web interface. And last but not least, feature I would like to show in Fireflow is the expiration date feature. So in many organizations, there is a lot of motivation to add new openings, but usually there is zero motivation to remove these openings when they're no longer required. So you can force your users to specify an expiration date, and usually around 1 month before the rule is about to expire, the system can send an email to the requester asking him or her whether this access is still needed. And based on their response or a lack of response, we can either delete this access or we can extend its validity period. That's it for Fireflow. We have one more product to present, AppViz, but if there are any questions, please go ahead, or Antonio, if you would like to summarize.
Okay, yes, no question. So I will summarize what we have just seen. Bueno, lo que acabamos de ver es la parte implementación automática, la etapa de implementación del workflow, ¿vale? Que se puede hacer de manera completamente automática o manual. O sea que si es en modo manual, eso se decide porque hay organizaciones que quieren que Algosec lo haga todo y otros quieren guardar el control. Incluso en ese modo, Algosec propone el cambio óptimo, ya sea creando una nueva regla o modificando una regla muy próxima para no saturar el firewall, ¿no? Y bueno, también hemos visto luego la etapa de validación, o sea que, bueno, aunque se confíe en lo que va a hacer el técnico en el cambio, pues eso no impide el control. O sea que Algosec va a controlar que al final lo que se ha pedido es lo que se ha implementado, ¿no? Porque si a nivel de implementación se hace any, una creación de regla any para cualquier servicio, pues vamos a dar el servicio, pero vamos a hacer un boquete de seguridad enorme, ¿no? Y entonces por eso hay esta etapa de validación a nivel individual de cada cambio, pero también luego viene el automatching. Automatching va a comprobar que todo lo que hemos pedido, todos los cambios en los routers, en los diferentes firewalls para proporcionar el servicio, todo funciona. Y entonces, ¿cuándo vamos a poder, por ejemplo, notificar a un ServiceNow bueno, que el servicio ya ha estado rendido y bueno, y para notificar que ya está funcionando, ¿vale? Y bueno, también hemos visto que hay diferentes casos de uso con su propio workflow y que luego dentro de cada workflow pues hay una capacidad de personalización bueno, que es muy avanzada. O sea, tenemos esa fama en el mercado de tener un workflow de los más personalizables y eso es súper importante porque cual sea el nivel de personalización requerido, pues se puede hacer con Algosec y no tienes que hacer desarrollo por encima de la herramienta, que eso luego impide poder hacer evolucionar la plataforma de versión en versión, lo que es muy importante porque como estamos simplificando la vida de los clientes que tienen una heterogeneidad enorme de diferentes tecnologías, pues hay que tener siempre la capacidad de hacer evolucionar para tomar en cuenta todas las evoluciones dentro de cada tecnología, ¿no? O sea que es algo muy importante esa evolutividad de la solución, cual sea el nivel de personalización, y eso es nuestra marca en el mercado. Okay, Max, you can go for the third and last module.
Okay, thank you, Antonio. And now we reach the latest model, that's AppViz. We already seen a glimpse of AppViz before, but to summarize, the idea behind AppViz is that we provide an interface not necessary for the network administrator, but more for the application owner. So for instance, let's take another application. If I manage the CRM hybrid application, I know my application. I know what server should communicate with what other server, whether it's a cloud endpoint or on-prem endpoint, it doesn't matter. But I am not necessarily familiar with the network, and I don't really care about the network because that's not my job. My job is to manage the application. So I can specify the connectivity requirements of my application, and Algosec would make sure that this is allowed on the relevant firewalls, on the relevant routers, that everything is properly working in the network. Now, how can we actually do this? The first thing we need to do is understand how your applications are working. So if you have existing documentation like CMDB or anything else, we can consume this information. If you're using third-party tools like Cisco Secure Work or what was previously known as Cisco Tetration, we can integrate with it as well. That's pretty straightforward. So if we go here to Discovery, for instance, we'll be able to present you with the different options for discovery. Just give it a moment to load. So here, one of the options is the Cisco Secure Workload. So if you have such discovery solution, we can utilize this and fetch information from Secure Workload. Now, if you don't have Secure Workload, or if you don't have any spreadsheets, CMDB, or any other information we can rely on, we have something we call auto discovery. I'll show you this in a moment. So the idea behind auto discovery is that we can analyze traffic logs as well as real network traffic and show you how different applications are working in your environment. For instance, here you can see that I have this asset management application. I have a single front-end server here that serves at the moment 149 active customers, active clients. And on the back end, you can see here all the communication. So this is something we can learn from traffic logs like NetFlow and SFlow. Sometimes this is insufficient, and when this is insufficient, we can actually perform auto discovery based on real traffic. So we can inspect, for instance, if it's a web application, we can inspect the HTTP header and see which URL is there. So for instance, if we go here to discover business services, you can see the URLs which are currently identified in my lab. For instance, you can see this builds gold algosec.com. So I can flag this URL as interesting, and then the system would associate all flows using this URL with my specific application, irrespective of the underlying IP addresses. Any questions about the discovery functionality before we move on?
No questions so far. Maybe a quick summary.
Sure.
Bueno, aquí hemos visto la primera parte de Avis, que es la parte de integración de la descubierta de los flows, de los flujos de las aplicaciones, ¿vale? Y eso se puede hacer de diferentes maneras. Si tenéis si el cliente tiene una CMDB en la que se fía, entonces se puede integrar todo ese modelo dentro de AppVis. O, segunda opción, tenemos una integración muy fuerte con Cisco Secure Workload, que antes se llamaba Tetration. De hecho, algo que no hemos dicho, pero es interesante, si alguno de vosotros sois partners de Cisco, Algosec está integrada en el catálogo de precios, la GPL, la Global Price List de Cisco, o sea que podéis vender Algosec como si fuera un producto de Cisco, ¿vale? Y dentro de esa integración, pues vamos a integrarnos con ACI, como lo hemos visto antes, pero también con Tetration, bueno, Secure Workload, con una interfaz estándar. Y si no se tiene ni nada como una CMDB o Cisco Tetration, pues también tenemos incluso dentro de AppVis un módulo que no es una opción, o sea, viene ya integrado dentro del producto, que permite, que es un motor de descubierta automática a base de explotación de los NetFlow, SFlow, o incluso a base de agentes en modo Deep Packets Inspection, para tener una visión completa de lo que nos interesa para formar ese modelo de cada aplicación con cada flujo que soporta esa aplicación. No sé si hay preguntas o si tenéis preguntas, ya sabéis, hay el chat. Y ahora vamos a ver la segunda parte. Una vez que se ha importado toda esa información de las aplicaciones, de la conectividad de las aplicaciones existentes, cómo vamos a manejar esa información y cómo vamos a ver todo los estudios de impacto que se pueden hacer entre aplicación, los flujos y por dónde pasa por la red, los firewalls y las reglas dentro de los firewalls. Ok, Max.
Okay, thank you, Antonio. So when we've discovered your applications using existing documentation, Cisco Secure Workload, or our own tools, we can do a lot of interesting things. So one thing we can do, we can first of all tell you whether there is any problem with the application connectivity requirements. For instance, you have here the CRM hybrid application. You can see it's highlighted in green, which means that everything is fine. However, if it's highlighted in red, it means that something is not working. So I can drill down and see, for instance, that flow number 4 is working properly. However, the first 3 flows are not working. Something is broken. So if I want to fix this, I can just click on resolve and the system would create the relevant change requests and make sure it's provisioned in the network. On top of that, a great advantage security-wise is because we understand how the application is working, which devices are in path, and which rules on these devices allow the traffic, we can map firewall rules to business applications. So let me show you an example. If we go to the, let's say, Palo Alto device, it's pretty much the same for all devices. You can see here that we have the business applications column. So we can see, for instance, that rule number 1 is serving these 3 applications, the LDAP, the CRM hybrid, and the CRM. So when you are done with your discovery process, ideally, each and every rule should serve at least one business application. And if you have a rule which is in place but is not serving any business application, potentially you might want to remove it. It also makes your life way easier security-wise, because if an auditor comes and asks you why this rule is there, you can always say, well, that's not my decision. That was a requirement of the application owner. So you can share the responsibility for the openings with the application owner. Now, when it comes to sharing responsibility, the application owner can actually see also which risks their application introduces. So for instance, if I own the web access application, I can see that I've asked for something which violates the PCI DSS standard, and I can drill down and see this specific risk, which the specific flow which triggers this risk. So for instance, you can see that I have asked to allow access to any, and any is included in the PCI zone, which is obviously a bad thing. And the 2 last thing I would like to mention today in the interest of time. First thing I would like to mention is impact analysis. You can ask the system a question. What happens if I bring down some device or some server? Let's say I would like to remove this Cisco ASA device and replace it with a new Firepower. I can click on search and the system will show me the business applications which rely on this device. So I can see that the CRM application, which is in production, relies on this device. So I can drill down, see exactly which flows would be impacted. So I can inform the technical owner or the business owner that their application would not work during this maintenance window. And the last thing I would like to mention for today is the migration project functionality. So you can instruct the system to migrate an application from location A to location B, or migrate a single server. So for instance, if we go to server migration project, we can specify the source. In this example, it can be one of my time clock servers, which are located in my own data center, and I can go ahead and move this to the Amazon cloud. And the idea here is that the new server, which has a new IP address, should have exactly the same network openings as the old server. So let's just give this project a name. I'll call it a test project. Click on update, and the system would automatically identify which applications rely on it. I can see that the CRM application relies on it because the old server was able to communicate with this server. Therefore, the new server should be able to communicate with it as well. So we can just continue, and the system would open the relevant change request and make changes on the relevant firewalls subject to your security approval. But to summarize, the main feature of the system is to provide another layer of abstraction where you manage business applications and not firewall rules, and bridge the gap between the application owners who speak the application language, but they're not familiar with the network, and the networking team, which knows their network really well. They speak source IP, destination IP, routing tables, but they're not familiar with the business application. So the idea here is to really bridge over this communication gap. So that's pretty much it for me. I think we've covered about 60% of the functionality of our products. One product we did not mention, and if you'll be interested, please let Antonio know, and we are happy to arrange a demo for you, is product called Cloudflow. Cloudflow is a software as a service product. Let me show you just the web interface. The idea here is that you can manage your public cloud security and assets using the Algosec offering. So here you can see that I have AWS and Azure subscriptions, so I can manage everything. I can see risk assessment and do a lot of nice things, but this is software as a service. A solution is completely managed by Algosec. That's pretty much it for me. If you have any questions, please go ahead. If not, I guess, Antonio, you can take it from here.